So I'm going to do 15 minutes on the politics. I'm then going to seamlessly pass over to Chris, who's going to talk about the economy, and then we'll let you ask questions about either or both together. The question earlier is, who is going to win the election? I don't think that's a particularly interesting question at this point. I think we all know the answer to that. So instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about what has been going on. So the chart there is an aggregated average of what's been happening for the last 5 years in the polls. And I think there are two different stories you can tell about this. The first is the dramatic story of Boris Johnson and Partygate. You'll see the big drop there around 21, 22 when Partygate happened. Then the very dramatic drop in popularity during Liz Truss's disastrous budget, a little bit of recovery for Rishi Sunak, and then very slow decline since then, and then a quite sharp drop during the election campaign since Nigel Farage entered the election. There's also a story that this is not that much more than a fairly straight line decline with a lot of noise around it, as the Conservative Party, like many countries, has faced a combination of COVID, major energy shock through Ukraine, massive struggles with cost of living, and being a fairly long-lived party that's been in government for a long time. There are a couple of other things, though, that I just want to stress on this chart before I move on. The first is that Labour is very, very substantially in the lead, about 20 points in the lead, but it is possible, indeed quite plausible, that they will win an unprecedented majority on the same percentage of the vote and fewer votes in total than in 2017, when they did not manage to win. And the reason for that is because of all of these third parties. And that's another thing that is quite unusual in the British context, is quite extraordinary about this election. So you will see that Reform, at least on many of the polls, is actually inching into second place, or they're in third. They are going to get a significant share of the national vote and effectively no seats, maybe a couple. The Lib Dems, meanwhile, are going to be doing much less well than Reform, and quite a lot less well than the Conservatives, but may even become the official opposition under some of the MRPs, which are all over the place, and certainly going to get far more votes than Reform. And what you've had for the last sort of 15 years in politics, which is a debate about whether there is a progressive majority in this country that is denied its representation because we're a first-past-the-post system, is now going to flip into a debate about a conservative majority in the country, which is denied its representation because of first-past-the-post. And I think that's one of the interesting debates that's going to evolve over the next 5 years, particularly given what's happening in Europe and America. So, why has that happened? And again, I'll just make a couple of points so we can come back to any of this in the questions. The Conservative vote has, as you can see, the left-hand side is the first column is the 2019 Conservative vote, and then you move into what's happened to those people, and then you look at what's happened to Leave and Remain voters, that's the second group of columns, and then you can look at what's happened to, on the right-hand side, Conservative voters by income. And what you'll see is that very few of those people have gone to Labour. Small proportion, but very few people have gone to Labour. A very significant proportion have gone to Reform, and quite a significant proportion, less than at the beginning of the election campaign, have gone to Don't Know. And because of the way that the Conservative original coalition has fractured, Labour is looking at one of the most efficient distributions of its vote imaginable. If you think that you had 40% of the votes in the country, where would you like them spread in a first-past-the-post system? You'd like them spread in such a way that you get a bit of a majority everywhere. They're not quite at that perfect scenario, but they're not that far off it. The other really remarkable thing about this election, and this is not true in other countries, is how much age is now determining vote. This becomes more and more true with every month that passes with the Conservative Party, but it's been true for some time that age and education are the huge determinants of voting intention in this country. And that, again, does contrast somewhat, and Anand and others might qualify this when they come on later, with what's happening, for example, in much of Europe, where the young are, in substantial part, going towards right-wing, and particularly right-wing populist parties. Even here, you are seeing a bit more vote for reform among 1824s than you are Conservatives. So it's only the old left who are voting for Conservatives. A couple of decades ago, that crossover would have been in the 40s. And people are perfectly happy with what might be about to happen. One of the questions that my polling company put in a couple of weeks ago, because we were curious about this supermajority narrative that you might have seen the Conservative Party is offering, don't let Keir Starmer have a supermajority, is a very significant percentage of the country and a very significant percentage of 2019 Conservative voters, around a quarter, would be perfectly happy if the Conservative Party got 0 seats at the next election. They are absolutely not worried at all about a supermajority. Maybe they'll become worried. They are done. And this is another thing that I think we don't appreciate enough now we've got used to, is really extraordinary about this election. I don't think there has ever been an election where you are looking at this great a landslide for such a negative reason. Starmer has negative approval ratings. He has less negative approval ratings than he did a couple of months ago, but in contrast, Blair, Cameron, every conceivable previous leader at this point election campaign going into a serious majority have very significant positive approval ratings. Normally what happens is you start positive and then everyone starts to hate you. Everyone already hates him. Not everyone. But that's really unusual. That is really, really unusual. And the reason, and there is no enthusiasm. I'll come on to anti-politics in a bit, but it is very unusual for this to be entirely about loathing the people who are in, rather than thinking that the people who are going to come in next are really going to improve things. And I think that's going to make a big difference to how politics plays out post the election. Unless the economy is going to be amazing, in which case, maybe it'll be different. Issues. We haven't actually had a very policy-heavy election. You will have noticed that the Labour Party's strategy has broadly been to say as little as possible because they don't want to damage their majority, perfectly rational. The Conservative Party has actually thrown a lot of policies out during this election campaign, but relatively few of them, with the exception of immigration, have been on the core questions that voters are most concerned about. So what have we seen happen? This has really been a story of 2 issues. I mentioned them earlier. It's been the post-COVID mess of the NHS, where waiting lists have rocketed much more than in other countries. And it has been a cost of living issue, which has happened everywhere, but we have, of course, had some particular challenges around inflation. It has also been, over the last year, an election that is seeing significant increase in concern around immigration, legal and illegal. And because of that, these are relative scores. Climate change has actually probably gone a bit down the agenda. And one thing I would flag is that while we don't have the level of environmental skepticism in this country that we do in other countries, there's not a huge polarization on climate, I would not assume that the consensus around ESG and climate that we've seen in Europe and Britain, and to a sort of degree in America over the last few years, is necessarily going to continue politically over the next few years. Immigration is the third issue, as I showed you before, but the reason immigration has been so dominant in this election campaign is partly because Farage is fun to talk about, and people like covering Farage, but also probably more seriously because immigration, which is the blue column, is a much bigger issue for people who were Conservative voters in 2019, who have switched away from Conservative, and particularly have switched to Reform, than it is for the public at large, who care more, substantially more, about the cost of living. So immigration is unquestionably an issue, but it's more an issue because our first-past-the-post system pushes us towards swing voters, and that's what a lot of swing voters want to talk about. It's also where, I think the light may make this hard to see, in which case I apologize. It's also one of the areas where people have historically thought the Conservatives were right and they care about it. One of the challenges that the Conservatives have is that top right box is quite lonely. And reducing migration is one of the few areas where people think of policy as very right-wing and they really care about it, and therefore assume Labour will be weak about it. The reason that hasn't worked for the Conservatives is because Farage entered the race, and that makes it very hard for them to talk about migration, and the fact that they raised it a lot. But without that, I think it was a plausible decision for them to focus on it substantially. The final thing I will say is, because I got asked this by various people before the presentation, is where is the Conservative vote breaking down? Is it happening more in industrial areas? Is it happening more in the kind of manufacturing areas that some of you present? It's not really obvious that that's what's happening. So the left two sets of bars are what we call the blue wall, Surrey, that kind of place, in 2019 versus 2024. And the right hand is what happened in the red wall, 2019 versus 2024. Now, lots of people engaged in polling will say that the blue wall, red wall thing was always overdone. But I think what is probably significant is that the level of decline in the Conservative support is not that different between them. But where those voters are going instead is very significantly different, with the blue wall going substantially Lib Dem, who are vanishingly absent in the national campaign, but will feel very present if you happen to live in a seat where the Lib Dems are fighting. Whereas in the red wall, where the Lib Dems have not historically had a base, they're moving to a mix of Reform and Labour. How am I doing on time? I've got 2 minutes left. One final thing then, on expectations and what might happen next. So we have a party that is not very popular and a leader who is really not very popular, about to get an unprecedented landslide in politics, and a greater percentage of the public than we have seen in possibly ever, certainly in a long time, unrepresented in terms of their vote versus what happens in Parliament. And we have plausibly a very low turnout election with high levels of apathy and high levels of general distaste in politicians. Like, this is a pretty toxic mix. And on top of that, actually a pretty high proportion of people, around half, think that Labour is going to sort out a whole range of issues within their first term. So one of the things that people who don't do lots of focus groups, I think, sometimes underestimate is that the public don't think issues are as complicated as we often tend to. So one of the analogies I give on that is net zero, where when you talk to the public, they kind of think that's the equivalent difficulty of putting on the 2012 Olympics, right? Like, it's a bit of a logistical push, but can we just get on with it? Similarly, they think broadly the reason things are in a mess isn't because it's hard, but just because everyone's really incompetent or they don't even want to try. And therefore, they think it shouldn't be that hard to fix. And as I'm sure Chris is about to tell us, that is difficult for a party coming in on relatively low approval and with an extremely tight fiscal situation. Now, I may be about to be told that there is such great economic news coming down the track that they will have a windfall and they will be able to force their way through these problems. But I don't think that the broad political landscape in Britain or in Europe or in America is that favourable. I will stop there.
Wonderful. Rachel, Chris Giles will now rescue the Labour Party in 15 minutes.
If only.
This is a fun. I'm serious. It's policy making.
And these days more perhaps than ever before. So if we think about the period we've been in, and maybe exactly where we were just before the 2019 election, get Brexit done was one slogan, level up the UK were others, both highly domestic ambitions for the Johnson government. Within a few months it was, how do we deal with an economy in a once-in-a-century pandemic? And then what do we do when there's a 1 in 80 years land war in Europe, or an energy crisis as bad as the 1970s. So the global context matters hugely. And the key global question, which we've been dealing with for the last 2 or 3 years, is inflation. I think one thing we now know, and if you look at some of the sort of detailed opinion polling or attitudinal polling to inflation, a lot of economists thought that maybe the public wouldn't like inflation very much, but we really know how they think about it, and they absolutely hate inflation. So one piece of relatively good news is that if you look at, here's the US, the Eurozone, and the UK, the similarities on this chart are much more important than the differences. We had a big spike in inflation, it happened slightly earlier in the US than it did in Europe, and then inflation has come down, that's the blue lines, pretty uniformly in all 3 economies. Service sectors is lagging behind a bit, so service sector inflation is lagging behind goods. But one of the things that's a little bit concerning is if you look, this is over the past 12 months, if we look at over the past 6 months, and we do it on the same scale, so it's annualized, you can see that there's been a bit of a blip upwards. And this is one of the bumps in the road that we're seeing in the disinflationary process. We see it in the UK, particularly in the service sector, and we've seen it in Europe as well, and the US. And this is one of the reasons why central bankers have been much more nervous and cautious this year than people thought they would be at the start of the year. So when we look at what's happening to interest rates, and in your business is clearly a very important question, both for your customers and for yourselves as a whole for investment, the view of what's going to happen to interest rates is, again, very similar across these 3 economies. At the start of the year, this is the market expectation. So if markets ever tell you that they forecast so much better than anyone else, you show them this chart. They thought there would be 6 quarter-point interest rate cuts pretty much in the US, by the European Central Bank and by the Bank of England this year. That was down to about 2 cuts now for the US. The ECB has already cut once, 2 to 3, and again the Bank of England, I would bet, would cut probably in August and maybe one more time, so the views are about 2 in the UK this year, down from again about 6 at the start of the year. And looking at 2025, so next year, that hasn't moved around so much. People haven't been quite focused on 2025 yet. But again, interest rates coming down, maybe once a quarter point, so gradually coming down. But this is going to help the economies in the Western world, so long as inflation does keep on this relatively bumpy, slightly difficult disinflationary process. But basically, we're not looking like we're going into the 1970s, where inflation becomes embedded and becomes a decade-long problem rather than a post-pandemic, really difficult issue. So if interest rates and inflation looking a little bit less clear than at the start of the year, but still relatively good, what does the global growth outlook look like? Well, here's the latest International Monetary Fund view of the world economy, and these are the averages over the last 40 years or so, averages around 3.4%, and here is the forecasts for the next 5 years ahead. Just a little bit below average, but pretty stable. It'll have a lot more Chinese and Indian growth in there and less from the advanced economies than in the 1980s and 1990s. But I can tell you that if we get this result, people will be very, very happy indeed that we have 5 years of relative stability in the global economy, no pandemics, no more wars, maybe no more even trade wars. That's what's underlying this picture. And that would make things look a lot easier for us all. And we have to remember that where Rachel talked about how much everyone really hates people who've been in power over the last year, whether it's the Conservatives in this country, but you can look at Joe Biden's poll ratings in the US, which are abysmal, and also across Europe in the big economies. It's been the global forces which have been particularly difficult. So if we were to have a more stable 5 years ahead, that would make things look a lot better. There's another reason why I think you can have some optimism, particularly in the European context. And again, I'm not treating the UK any differently from continental Europe here, because we've both essentially been facing the same shocks, and that's private consumption. There has been no growth in private consumption at all since 2019. Not here, not France, not Germany, not the Eurozone, but in the US, they've gone straight back to the pre-COVID path. Now, partly that might be that US people are generally more optimistic and they've been out there saying, right, we're back to normal, let's go and spend. But equally, the US didn't face the same energy crisis that Europeans have faced. We are largely through that energy crisis. Particularly gas prices went sky high, tenfold increase in 2022 and have come down. They're still about twice the level they were before the energy crisis, but that is something that people and companies can deal with, and we have essentially made that adjustment now. So from here on in, I think when we see real income gains, that should translate into consumption gains. So again, that is something good, that is something different from the past 5 years that's likely to happen in the next 5 years. But I couldn't just do this and say, look, it's all quite stable and all quite good and go away and it's all going to be fine, without pointing out there are a lot of threats to this sort of more benign picture that I'm painting in the global economy. First of all, that inflation isn't quite vanquished yet, and so that could rear its ugly head. It did in the 1970s. That was mostly because in the end, conflicts between companies and wages and workers became really serious, and there were strikes and then a real battle over the shares of the economy. So long as energy prices remain under control, I would hope that we wouldn't see the same here, but there's no guarantee of that. We know that the Chinese economy is certainly struggling at the moment, and it's struggling particularly in its domestic property sector. And one of the Chinese responses to the difficulties that they've been having since 2022, nearly every Western economist would say, what you need to do, fiscal stimulus, give it to your population, they will go and spend domestically, that will help you out. But what the Chinese government has been doing is fiscal stimulus to your domestic industry and trying to do it through export-led growth. It's worked very often in the past for China as it's been industrializing. The trouble is that China's now 20-something% of the global economy. It's too big to export its way out without having severe tensions elsewhere, and particularly in your sector, in the EV sector. We're seeing this coming to a head in the US, where Joe Biden has put 100% tariffs on, and in the EU, where we've seen a slightly more moderate but still pretty severe tariff response to China. What people see is Chinese artificial subsidies and then an attempt to export at the expense of people's jobs in Europe. So another big threat over the next 5 years is clearly trade tensions across the world. They're certainly not going to diffuse. They are going to get worse. They're going to get a lot worse if we have a Trump administration in the US, but even under a Biden administration, it's certainly not going to be an era of global trade peace. The question really is how damaging is that? And then the final threat to global economic harmony is the geopolitical situation. At the weekend, we are going to see a really quite seismic change just across the channel. And then in November, we've got quite an important election in the most important country in the world. So if that's the global backdrop, what does it mean for us? Now, I think we do need to understand how we're seen abroad. And one of our illustrators put this together, which I think sums up how the UK is seen and how its economy is seen abroad. It's something that's really sort of an economy under rather cloudy skies, where politicians might have the shelf life of a lettuce. And it's not entirely unfair. If you look, and I'm going to do this, if you look at how our economy has performed, And you can get lots of different answers if you look at comparing with other countries, different timescales. But if you just look at forecasts for us from the IMF, but this would be for anyone's forecast, and how they've progressed over time. So from 2008, this is every forecast the IMF has produced. You can see that they just get lower and lower and lower. And you have repeated disappointments. So the most recent one, April 2024. So that is what's happened to the UK economy. That is the disappointments we've seen. We used to think we could grow at about 2.75% a year. At most optimistic, we think it's about 1.5% now. And that is why things have felt difficult, because it's much harder to make people better off or to have flourishing public services when you only grow at 1 to 1.5% a year. But let's have some good news at the moment. There are green shoots in the economy right now. You can see this in consumer confidence. It's not at a high level, but it's recovered enormously from the 2022 trough. Business confidence, again, not high, but again, it's not in a bad state. This isn't a terrible time for business. They're not feeling bad, and we saw in the poll earlier that this industry is feeling similar to other industries that don't feel too bad about things. Business investment is finally recovering. We've had 8 years of pretty stagnant investment in this country, but we really are now seeing some growth, and hopefully that can continue. This can all create a period with higher consumption as well of catch-up and feeling a little bit better. But we do know how difficult it can be for Rachel Reeves, who we all expect to be the Shadow Chancellor in a little over a week's time. Public services are in a very difficult position. The public finances are stretched. There's not a lot of money to spend. So you can see how this could all become overwhelming quite quickly. But I think there's an alternative. There's an alternative way of looking at it, which I think actually is slightly more likely than it all goes horribly wrong and Labour become incredibly unpopular incredibly quickly, which is perfectly possible. I wouldn't say that at all. Which is you get a rather a situation where in the short term, Labour blames all bad things on the previous government. Anything bad, their fault. Anything good, that's because we've just come in. We have some stability, and we have these green shoots in the economy. Things look a little bit better. They don't spend a lot of money quickly. There's no sudden budget. There's no opening the books moment. And then in about 2 years or so, they come out with their strategy of what they want to do with the country. In fact, they literally play the same book that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did after 1997, with a bit of a harder hand, a bit of a tougher hand, but it's not impossible. So just to say, how could this happen? I'm just going to really paint a very quick scenario of how could you have a bit of luck and all be feeling better about ourselves. So we don't just go away saying we've had a terrible 5 years and it's just going to be Labour going to get in and it's going to be terrible for them too. So I said that maybe the next 5 years the global situation will be a little bit more stable. It can't be much less stable. It can't be more difficult than this government has had to deal with. So you could have inflation coming down and you have interest rates coming down just a little bit like where markets expect. People then feel there's a little bit more money in their pockets. There's some green shoots in the economy already, investments picking up. So you get a bit of momentum behind things, and when people see their own companies, their place of work doing a bit better, they then want to go out and spend a little bit more. And you get a bit of, at least for a period, a virtuous circle, some growth. And because we think there's room for catch-up, it's not necessarily inflationary. Inflation is coming down. And we get a bit of money to ease the wheel of things like public sector pay. And you get into a period, we'll see how long that goes, where we can have a bit of a virtuous circle. So this is not guaranteed. There are many, many things that can go wrong. But I think when we look ahead, we are often very negative about the world, and we should remember there are some upsides and upside risks which can happen too. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Chris, have a seat. Rachel, do you want to come back Let's get Rachel back up as well. We've got 5 minutes for questions. So we've got microphones that will roam around. So anyone who's got a question, feel free to put it to him. If what Chris just said is right, why on earth did he call the election early? I mean, do we know yet?
No one has come up with a compelling reason, other than he was just done, why he called the election early.
It is fascinating, that, isn't it?
But I can understand why he might have just felt done.
Just go for it, yeah. A question for both of you, while people are working out what they want to ask. This is something that the conference actually today started with at the press conference. And they've sort of said it before, but Stellantis saying very clearly when it comes to zero emissions targets and the proportion that you have to have of your sales in zero emission vehicles and the tightening of all of that year on year and all the rules that are coming in. You know what? We're not going to sell vehicles here at a loss. Indeed, we're not even going to make them here at a loss. So Stellantis saying at the press conference this morning, and has already sort of made a bit of news from here. If they say that, which they will do to an incoming Labour government, in a kind of practical sense, what do both of you feel from your knowledge behind the scenes of the people who are coming into power, if indeed they are coming into power? I have to say that because I work for the BBC. But if they are indeed coming into power, with a question like that, when someone is saying in practical terms, you know what, your policies at the moment are going to reduce growth because we're going to stop doing X, Y, or Z, what do they do?
Chris, what do you think they do?
I think a new government will be quite tough with them, because for Social Democrats at the moment, green issues are about as central to their platform as possible. And I think companies might say, well, look, things are, this is the future. We certainly wouldn't want you to leave us, but you do need to get with the program, because I don't think there's other places in Europe that are likely to have a much laxer environmental regime at the moment than us.
Yeah, interesting.
So this is where I now feel stung that I'm the negative person in the room. I'm not sure we are collectively thinking enough about the plausible interaction between British and European politics over the next 5 to 10 years. And Britain, as Chris's quite harsh illustration showed, has been seen as a sort of slightly odd outlier to Europe for the last 5 to 6 years. And I think we're going to be a slightly odd outlier again, but in the opposite direction. And it seems to me at least possible that if Trump gets in, if Europe keeps traveling right as fast as it is doing right now, if the major economies of Europe, including France, start being run by radically more environmentally skeptic parties, that the credible threat from international companies becomes more credible. And I don't think that's immediate, but I'd certainly, if I were in your shoes, be planning on that basis.
Yeah, interesting one. And we'll talk, of course, more about Europe. If I could see him already in his seat, ready to talk to us with Anna Menon later on in the afternoon. In fact, it's the last thing we will do. Anyone with a question for either of these two? And then I will, if there isn't, no, you've actually stunned them into silence. Yes, lady there, right next to the microphone.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask, the elephant in the room really is Brexit. And all day we've heard about the impact on supply chains. I suppose the best we can hope for an incoming government is that we will have an easier arrangement negotiated in 2024. I'm a Conservative backbencher in the House of Lords. My own pennyworth for why I think the Prime Minister chose to go early is lack of discipline and that huge insecurity on the backbenchers. I think it was as simple as that. And also, good weather often brings good results, but possibly not in this case.
Yeah. Tell us about the economics of the. I mean, we're going to hear from Anand later on about what the Europeans think of us, as it were. I mean, there are plenty of Europeans here, but what might be considered by them to be in it for them if we were to have a closer relationship when it comes to trade. From the perspective of growth, how important is it going to be for an incoming Labour government to have that closer relationship? What actual difference do we do? Can we kind of quantify the difference it could make?
I think we can quantify it, and it's small. I mean, I think that's the key thing. We've taken a hit by leaving. Having some sort of closer relationship is worth having, but we're not going to join the single market. We're not going to join the customs union unless Labour are telling us complete porkies. And so the big things are not going to happen, not in one parliament. Maybe they might roll the pitch for having it in election in 2029, although I think that's also unlikely. So what you can do is on the sort of useful but not seismic scale.
Yeah. Rachel, you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. And if what Labour want to do is push up the virtuous cycle that Chris mentioned, they want things that don't absorb all of their political time and might show some results relatively quickly. And I'd be very surprised if completely reopening Europe fell into that bucket.
Okay, well, we will, as I say, go on to Europe and what Europe might feel about us in our last session with Anand, but from both of you for the time being. Thank you hugely. Very good.